Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to That's Hockey Talk. Yes, we are still putting out an episode for you. Even though there is no hockey, we're still talking. AQ is with me. He's in the car right now. He's got some important business here coming up right in the middle of free agency. How you doing, buddy? How you handling the quarantine?
Good, bud. I don't believe in the quarantine. I'm going out. I'm going to every place I want to go. I'm shaking hands. I'm bumping elbows. I'm living life, guys.
You're what's wrong with America.
Yep.
You're what's wrong with everything
sure
right
am.
now.
Yep, I sure am.
Sports are canceled because of you. Disgusting.
We're moving forward.
All right, well, we got an interview for you today with Mike Commito, at Mike Commito on Twitter. You got to go check him out. You got to follow him. He's a big hockey history guy. I love following this guy. AQ, I believe you got to go talk to your agent, so you get the hell out of here. We'll talk to you in a little bit. All right, let's jump in. Ladies and gentlemen, joining us now on the phone, an individual who I found on Twitter because he was posting highlights of Mario Lemieux, and I am a complete sucker for old school Pens highlights, and I will follow 10 times out of 10 if you continuously post awesome old clips of Lemieux. But he does much more than that. He's a writer for the LA Kings. He's the author of Hockey 365, a team historian for the Sudbury Wolves, and the director of applied research and innovation at Cambrian College, and most importantly, a girl dad, and I completely shamelessly stole all that information straight from his Twitter bio. Mike Commito joining us. Mike, how's it going?
It's going great. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. Yes, that's usually how I snag people on Twitter is Mario Lemieux highlights, so you're not alone.
I mean, I'm a complete shill for the Penguins, and especially for Lemieux. I got the jersey hanging in the studio here with me, and he's the guy, and it's one of the reasons I started following you. I saw you post the highlights, and then I looked through your bio, and I saw team historian, and I saw author, and I was like, okay, this guy knows his stuff here. So I've been following you for the past couple months now, and I gotta say, like every couple days or weeks or so, you'll put out a tweet like, on this day this player did this, and it's always so interesting to learn and follow and kind of remember this stuff. Nostalgia is the best drug going.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I've definitely noticed a bit of a spike recently with no hockey being on. I think people are gravitating towards any kind of highlight they can get or any pleasant memory of hockey, and so it's great to, especially right now, to be able to share those moments from the past to try to help people, think of the future, and hopefully with the game coming back at some point.
So help me learn a little bit about you and the listeners as well, because like I said, I follow you on Twitter. We haven't spoken personally until recently when you agreed to come on the show. Thank you so much for that, obviously. But can you tell us a little bit how you got into the game and how you got into your current role as a writer for the Kings?
Yeah, no problem. I mean, I'd always loved hockey as a kid. I was never really that great at it, never played it at an organized level, but played it outside as much as I could. But I really liked, reading the stories on the back of hockey cards, kind of getting the history of the game, players, and even I remember when I was younger, they used to do hockey cards about the trophies and learning the story about how the trophies got their names and how they were awarded and all that stuff, right? So then as we fast forward, I was actually going to school to become a historian. I did a lot of my time at school studying environmental history. My dissertation was about black bear hunting, and then through the course of my yeah. So that's a whole other story where I used to put on a bear costume here and do bear safety in Sudbury, Ontario. But that's probably saved best for another conversation. But anyway, all that to say that while I was doing my dissertation and writing and researching about the history of black bear hunting and management, I started to realize that the skills I had as a historian, writing, research, communication, all those things, could be applied to things that I liked outside of school, right? So I got into hockey writing, started doing my own blog personally. My mom was probably the only one that read it, but ultimately it kind of gave me something to start building a portfolio. I got some other writing opportunities. I started blogging for the Royal Half, which was a Kings fan blog, and did a lot of stuff with them for a season. And I think that really just kind of led me down the path of now then realizing that some of the stuff I was doing for my own site and with the Royal Half, it was cool as a Frankenstein mashup of regular history and hockey. And then what I realized that it was I was splitting both those things together when really I should have been focusing on hockey history. And so I started doing more writing, for places like Sportsnet and Vice Sports, where I was just focusing on a singular hockey history moment. And that kind of went on for a couple of years. I wrote the book, got a really unique opportunity to become the team historian for the Sudbury Wolves, which is our local junior club here. And then not long after that, the Kings reached out and wanted to see if I'd be interested in contributing to their website, kind of in the same vein, doing a lot of Kings history. But even, from my vantage point here in Sudbury, I have a unique perspective where some of their prospects come through town to play the Sudbury Wolves. So it's been a pretty wild ride. I think if you would have told me even 5 years ago that I'd be doing a lot of hockey history writing and writing for an NHL team and, having an official role with the junior club, I would have laughed at you. But it's certainly, you never know where your life is going to take you. You never know which skill sets you can leverage to get some of these cool opportunities.
That is one hell of a road to get to where you are now. Can we rewind a little bit and please tell me more about this black bear hunting? Were you actually hunting at all, or was it just basically study and research of the history of it?
Yeah, no, I was just studying the research. I think before I started doing my dissertation, I did a little bit of hunting here in Sudbury, Ontario, which is in northern Ontario, and I did a lot of grouse upland bird hunting. Thought I wanted to do bear hunting, and then quickly realized that I had no interest in shooting a bear. So during the course of my dissertation, when I was researching this, I kind of distanced myself from the whole hunting aspect. Where I was more interested in just kind of learning about and researching, why the government here in Ontario made certain policies and why, bears could be hunted in the spring or not in the spring, and all those different things. So yeah, I spent a good 4.5 years of my life researching that. Got my PhD, and then, haven't really looked back.
Is bear hunting that common up there? Because the way you're talking about it makes it sound so casual. Here, it definitely happens around here in the States, but it seems like it's much more like a elite level of hunting and very skilled and secular.
Yeah, no, it's quite popular. I think it's kind of a niche activity, but there are anywhere between 85,000 and 105,000 black bears in Ontario the last time I checked.
Wow.
And so there's the fall hunt happens, and then the spring hunt was the most popular activity, and that's actually when you used to get a lot of Americans that would come up to northern Ontario, and they would do these guided hunts in the springtime. That was actually canceled back in 1999, which is a huge controversy here in Ontario. They brought it back, I think, in 2014, and it was again another controversy because the argument rightfully is that hunting bears in the springtime is not really sport. They're just kind of coming out in hibernation and potentially orphaning cubs by inadvertently shooting a mother bear. So that was that was the world I lived in, and then kind of slowly waded out of that, got more into hockey, finished up all my research with the Bears, but kind of left that behind and pivoted into hockey.
Man, you are thorough. I'll give you that. All right. Well, enough of the bear talk. I'm sorry. I was just fascinated by that.
Yeah.
So you're with Sudbury as well. What players have come through there that you've seen go on to have major NHL success?
Well, so I've only been with the Wolves in an official capacity in a couple of years, but I mean, I've been living in Sudbury since I was 15 years old. So I've seen players like Nick Foligno, Mark Stahl, those guys come through. They had a really big playoff run in 2007 where they went all the way to the OHL final, lost in a bit of a heartbreaker, but it was one of the best live hockey experiences I've ever seen. We have the Sudbury Arena here, which holds 5,000 people with standing room, and that building was absolutely electric during that playoff run in 2007. So you see a lot of those guys come through at that time. Then there was a bit of a lull period after that where the Wolves weren't very competitive. They weren't graduating a lot of NHL players into the league, and so there was kind of a dry spell there where Sudbury, which was formerly known as the hockey factories, or the NHL hockey factories they like to call it, was kind of in a bit of a drought. We saw that change last year. Blake Murray got drafted to the Hurricanes, which made him the first NHL player, Wolves player to get drafted to the NHL in quite some time. And then obviously this year, we don't know what the draft is going to be, but Quinton Byfield, who's been absolutely phenomenal for the Wolves for his past 2 seasons, is likely to go in the top 3. If he goes number 2, he'll be the highest drafted Wolves player in NHL in Wolves history, which will be a pretty incredible feat. Mike Foligno went 3rd overall in 1979.
There we go, getting back on top. I like to see that.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about juniors as an institution, kind of, because it's very big in Canada, not so nearly as big here in the States. A lot of kids go play college hockey, and a lot of listeners are new to the sport or are kind of casual fans. And I'm kind of curious myself. Juniors as an institution, is the main goal of these teams are they operating strictly as a business? Are they trying to turn a profit, or is it more like a true development system for the kids?
I think it really depends on the franchise that you're looking at, but ultimately I think they have both interests in mind. Obviously, I think from a business viability perspective, you have to be thinking about trying to stay profitable so that you can reinvest some of that money into your facilities and the services you're providing to these players when they're coming through. I mean, even with the Wolves in the last couple of years that I've witnessed firsthand, is they've really tried to elevate that in-game experience, because I think they recognize it, especially in smaller towns. And I think that's kind of why junior hockey is such an institution in Canada. Is you have smaller cities like Sudbury that has, a population of 160,000 if you include all of the surrounding areas. So for us to have, a junior team and have the ability to watch players come through on other clubs or watch players come through our ranks that are going to go into the NHL is really that's the highest level of sport you're going to see in town, right? And so I think people gravitate to that. And so, certainly before and still now, it is a partnership with those NHL clubs as these players develop. But yeah, it's cool to kind of see how it's evolved over the years and how you're increasingly seeing, how much emphasis the clubs are putting on operating as a business and trying to make the most encompassing experience for fans, but also recognizing that they are developing NHL talent here and they have to be doing that, investing into that and making sure that the players they're graduating and retaining, are being able to play the game at the highest level.
That makes sense. And a lot of times, I've always thought that there seems to be like a type of maturity when it comes to hockey players in terms of when you look at them compared to other sports, because a lot of them went through this juniors process where a lot of times these guys are 14, 15 years old and they're leaving home and they're living with foster families and they're basically being treated as professionals in some regards. They're being paid, they're living away from home. They're having to figure out things out on their own. So I feel like that helps them mature at an earlier age and kind of deal with a lot of other things that they see early in life that a lot of people just wouldn't have to deal with until if you're an NFL player and until you're 22, 23, drafted possibly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, with because of how much of a cultural phenomenon junior hockey is, a lot of these guys are, thrust into the limelight at an early age, like you mentioned, right? So they're going through, media scrums, they're talking with reporters, and so they're getting that training so that when they graduate and potentially go into the NHL or pro career or, collegiate hockey or whatever it may be here in Canada, they have a lot of that experience, and they often do seem much older than they actually are. You kind of sometimes forget that these are often teenagers, right? Even when they're leaving the league, they're only 20 years old or so, right? So that's always something to keep in mind, especially when the World Juniors come along every year. You see how people react towards certain players online if they didn't perform to their expectations. But again, in many respects, these still are kids, right? And so as much as we kind of view them as professional athletes, even though they're not, they are still developing, they're still maturing, and so I think it's important to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, I always try and keep that in the back of my head when you want to go on Twitter and you want to say something mean about a kid because he didn't make a play. It's like, well, they're trying to figure it out. They're 18, they're 19, they're trying to figure it out. Let's talk about your book, Hockey 365. Obviously, very research-oriented, historian background. What made you want to write the book, and how did you come up with the stories for the book? What was really the mindset there?
I had so I'll have to briefly just go back to the Bears. So at the time, I was under contract to write a book about bear hunting based on my dissertation. It all comes back to the Bears. It always goes back to the Bears. And so I was on vacation in Mexico, and I was reading Val James's autobiography, and I realized at that point, life was too short. If I didn't want to write a book about Bears, which I didn't at the time, I really wanted to write about hockey. I figured there's no time like the present, and I decided to get out of my contract to write that other book and started pursuing options, to write Hockey 365. And the inspiration for the book actually came from a lot of the stuff that I was doing on Twitter, where I'm doing those daily history moments, and then also a lot of the writing that I was doing at the time with Vice Sports and Sportsnet. So I took a lot of the stories that I already put together and thought that it'd be kind of cool if I kind of had a bunch of those different types of stories throughout the book that focused on different moments, and they weren't, very in-depth, but they'd be kind of short snapshots of hockey history. And so as I found a publisher and we kind of developed the idea further, it really kind of became a better fit to develop, one page per story. So if you were to get the book, it's 365 short hockey history stories, one page per story, and one story per year. So there's actually 366 because I wanted to account for leap years, but ultimately Hockey 366 does not quite have the same ring, but you do get an extra bonus story in there if you want to pick up a copy.
That's beautiful. Can you share us a couple examples of what's in there? Because I know we talked previously before recording, and I told you to get some Pens stuff ready because I'm a huge Pens fan.
Yeah, no, there's, I mean, right off the top, just kind of go back to what you led with Mario Lemieux. Like, I ended the book with December 31st, so New Year's Eve, when Mario scored 5 goals 5 ways, which is ultimately, I think, one of the most iconic performances in hockey history. So I felt that was important to have that in there again, to be able to, given what he did, to score 5 goals 5 ways, as I've already said, is just it was quite the feat. So, I mean, if you go back, that's in there. So I kind of detail all those goals, including the empty netter, if that happened just with a couple seconds left on the clock, to really kind of put this all together and have it go down in hockey history as one of the most, iconic performances that I'm sure a lot of Pens fans would point to. But there's other stories in the book as well. With the Penguins, again, they all kind of go back to Mario Lemieux. But one that I think about as well is that when he became owner of the Penguins in '99, right? Obviously, as you know, the team was in financial hardship at that time. It seemed like it was destined for relocation or disbursement of players, but ultimately Lemieux came in with an idea that rather than kind of trying to get that $30 million in deferred salary that was owed to him, that they can convert that into a stake. He could take ownership of the club, and ultimately we know what happened after that, and it worked out in the end. So there's definitely a lot of Lemieux stories in that book, a few Crosby stories as well. And I mean, even today, if we were to go outside of the book, I had a couple more Penguins moments in my timeline. Again, today, Ron Stackhouse scoring 3 power play goals, which was the first time a Penguin had scored 3 power play goals. He did that back in 1979. So you'll find a lot of the Penguin stuff on Twitter, but certainly there's a lot of Penguin stuff in the book too.
I mean, I love to hear that stuff. The Lemieux thing, that's one that there's always a question of which records will never be broken, and we always assume Gretzky's points record. A lot of people thought Gretzky's goal record, but it looks like Ovechkin is going to come in at least in the territory of that, if not break it. And that 5 goals, 5 different ways one, I like to throw that out there as one because the game's so specialized now. You got a lot of guys who only kill penalties or only play power play time, and they don't mix and interact. You hardly see penalty shots called anymore. And the way he was just so skilled and so big, and he could play in all facets of the game, it's going to be hard for anyone to be able to replicate that. So I love that one. I hope that stands the test of the time for him. And then, like you said, the ownership thing, as much as we talk about him as fans, he probably doesn't get talked about enough because he doesn't like the limelight. He's one of those guys who likes to kind of be back in the shadows a little bit. And, I mean, he really did save that franchise twice in Pittsburgh and save it from relocation. And we can't thank him enough for what he's done for the city. But that's incredible. And now you're writing for the Kings, who obviously have had one of the best decades in their team's history, except for the latter half here. They've fallen on some hard times. What's the vibe like with the Kings organization right now? Are they upbeat because they have this huge deep prospect pool, or is it still a lot of looking back, trying to think like what could have been?
No, I think the club is definitely looking towards the future. As you mentioned, it arguably has one of the deepest prospect pools in the league, and potentially only getting deeper depending on how the ping pong balls bounce this summer. So, I mean, I think for a club like that who's had such recent success, winning 2 Stanley Cups in a span of 3 years in 2012 and 2014, you kind of, I think, have a little more patience ultimately as to where this is going. And I think the team has done well, by rebuilding through the draft or by, trading away players for assets that they can then use at the draft or to bring in other pieces. So I think that, obviously fans want to see results, but I think given the fact that, you've seen what can happen when you have all those pieces kind of come together at the right time and win Stanley Cups, I think that's kind of what obviously is the next phase, right? So we're not quite in the point yet where I think, fans are impatient. I think, especially even the last, 7 games before this hiatus, they had won 7 straight, which was something, and again, they were kind of more fun to watch, and you could tell that their moods were kind of becoming more upbeat. Drew Doughty was pretty vocal throughout the year about how, it's kind of a slog for him. I mean, this is somebody had been used to winning for many years, and then, the last 2 seasons have obviously been difficult for them, right? So it's hard to adjust to that, but I think ultimately the future is I'm optimistic about the future. I think it's bright. It just depends on how all of these guys translate to the NHL. But I think the Kings have done everything to potentially, shore up that prospect pool and hopefully get that next crop of guys that'll come in under the tutelage of veterans like Brown, Kopitar, and Doughty, and kind of get that next core lined up for hopefully, another championship.
Yeah, and speaking to that a little bit more, you mentioned the 7-game winning streak, and it seemed like things were turning around there. Obviously, they weren't going to make the playoffs, but, I mean, it's always at least positive to send that down to the younger guys, like, hey, this is how you compete, this is how you string wins together, all important lessons. I saw a tweet, and I want to talk to you about it. I guess they were talking about this on TSN, Pierre LeBrun, Frank Salavelli, and Darren Dreger, about a proposal from the players and the Board of Governors, some players and the Board of Governors, about a potential timeline for the season restarting amidst all this coronavirus madness. And it looks like they were projecting or anticipating training camp possibly starting in early July. That would have the league year 2019-2020 finishing in late July. Then we would roll in the playoffs through August and September, then go into draft free agency in October. 2020-2021 league year begins in November. To me, I'm not super optimistic, but it's nice to see they're at least trying to get some things in place if they can fire this back up. Because there are a lot of teams, I mean, this year that we're getting ready to gear up here and make a run. Obviously, fans are missing out, players are missing out, and you'd hate to see the league cancel an entire season. One of the few big history facts I do know is that the Stanley Cup wasn't given out in 1919 because of the Spanish flu epidemic, and I would hate to see another strain here of a virus come through and wipe it out again. Have you seen this or heard this proposal at all or anything? And I just want to see if you have any thoughts on it.
Yeah, no, I saw that proposal when it was kind of making the rounds yesterday. I mean, it's certainly interesting. My kind of sense is, I'm like you. I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, at least that we're talking about it. Whether or not this is a viable format is, I think, kind of the other thing, right? I mean, it seems more likely, depending on how long this break lasts, that players are certainly going to need, a training camp period to get back up into game speed and game shape. But whereas, whether or not it's worth playing the remaining 10 games of the season, obviously there's a lot of factors in there with, trying to figure out how you're going to do the playoffs if you don't complete the season. But I think it gives the NHL an opportunity potentially to do something completely different and try to work on a different playoff scenario to, how to help save some time and rather not play those remaining, 10, 12 games. Because obviously if you look at this proposal and you have the playoffs ending in September, you're really only giving the players a month off before you'd have them back in November, which, again, fatigue, leads to injuries, all those sorts of things that owners and players don't want. It is interesting, though, because, again, what does that mean for the next season, right? Because if you start in November, are we then now starting the season, we're starting the season a month later, are we then expecting the season to go a month later the following year in 2020-21, or will we be looking at a scenario potentially where we then shorten the following season down to 70 games, which would pretty much shave 12, 14 games is typically what they play in a month. That would bring you back down, towards that end of March, early April period, right? And then you can kind of reset and then, maybe look at other ways to try to get, an extended break over the summertime. So, I mean, that'll be the kind of interesting thing is what we don't really know what the long-term impact of all of this will be, but it could potentially change, some of the formats when it comes to playoffs or even the schedule, right? The NHL used to have much shorter schedules than they do right now, and maybe this is an incentive to try to maybe look at that. Or, again, to kind of think outside the box of what can we do with the playoffs rather than trying to just play out the rest of the season to do the usual format. Maybe because of the extenuating circumstances this year, now is the time to try out something really innovative. But it's the one thing I wanted to note on this, because it applies back to the Penguins for all the listeners there, is that, in the 2005 year, that's when Crosby was drafted, right? So everybody remembers that. But what few people probably remember at the top of the when you say that, is that draft wasn't held until the end of July because of the lockout that year, right? Yeah. And so it was supposed to be at the Corral Center in Ottawa, but because we didn't know when the lockout was going to end, they weren't really able to book it on such short notice. So it was actually held at the Westin Hotel in Ottawa, and it was closed to the public, and you only had the top 20 prospects who were invited. So it was an unusual situation, and so You see the moment of Crosby putting on the Penguins gear, but it's obviously out of sync with all the other venues we have where it's packed full of people. You have all the families there. You have prospects in multiple rounds that are there. And ultimately, whether or not we have that draft in October or we still have it later in the summer, we're probably looking at another scenario like that where it's much more limited because, again, we don't know what is going to happen with this. Is it going to, flare up again towards the fall? And if so, are we going to have to take some safeguards around reducing the amount of people at the draft, or will we even have an in-person draft? So that'll be interesting to see how that shakes out.
Yeah, when I first looked at this, I had some of the same thoughts of the long-term process and what that would look like. And I don't know if you're an NBA fan at all, but I know Steve Koonin, who's the owner of the Atlanta Hawks, kind of pitched this to the NBA, like pushing their season back, starting it later in the year so they're not competing with football. And I've always thought hockey could benefit from doing the same thing, but the problem you run into in playing later in the summer, obviously, is the quality of the ice in a lot of arenas. But I thought back to not the 05-06 lockout, but the most recent lockout where they did manage to still play half the season. I think the league started, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm sure you'll know, if it was December or January that they fired things back up, and they went with somewhat, I think it was either a 48 or a 60 game schedule, and it was electric because it was literally every other night there were quality games on TV because they had to jam pack and condense that schedule and to make it fit. That's kind of the model my head went to and was hopeful that they could replicate something like that. But it's interesting times. It's wild times. We've never seen anything like this. Hopeful, again, like you said, cautiously optimistic. But I don't know. But the good news is our co-host, AQ Shipley, has finally joined the show. We got him on FaceTime here. When I set this up, very selfish of me, I completely forgot that this is in the middle of NFL free agency. So AQ's handling some business over there. But AQ, welcome.
Hey, thanks, guys. I'm trying to figure out where my job continues, but it's still early. We're trying to figure this thing out. I missed some of this stuff. Mike, if you don't mind me asking a couple questions here.
Yeah, for sure.
So, obviously, if you answered this, just tell me. I completely apologize. But where, moving forward with the season, if it does start back up in September or October, whatever like that. So now, some of these guys who have been on long-term IR or something like that, now are they able to just come back right away and roll in like as if nothing happened? Or they got to stick with the rosters they had? Or has there been any talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a piece that hasn't really been sorted out yet, right? I think that ultimately, it's especially, depending on how late it happens, there's a lot of, transactions that'll kind of be impacted by this and like how far, because again, if you're having free agency and all these like from the logistical perspective, these contracts are ending for these guys, typically at that point in time, right? So then technically are these guys, how are we doing that if they're supposed to be free agents in July, but we're not playing until July, August? Are we going to waive, some of those existing things? But again, you got to worry about the insurance and, the health of these guys. So how does that all play out, right? So there's actually some, I think, really mundane logistical things that I'm sure they're working on as we speak, to try to figure out what we're going to do with a lot of those, key dates that normally happen in the summertime, which may be shifted because we're going to be playing the playoffs potentially, into July and August, which is that is, I think, the wild card that, until we have a firm grasp as to when, we're able to resume these types of activities, and how is that going to look, right? I mean, Nick was talking about how in 2013, when they came back in January, they played 48 games, but they only played within their respective conferences, right? And so I think that is the other thing, too, is that whatever they do, if they do decide they want to keep that regular season and play those last 10 games, that schedule is going to look completely different anyway, because they're not going to want to spend time, traveling. I think you'd have to have a scenario where you tighten it up, and if you do want to play those remaining 10, 12 games, probably within the conference, maybe even just within the division, just to try to give those teams the opportunity to play, the games that they were promised and try to make a run for the playoffs.
It's so interesting. I mean, it really is. I mean, I think what a lot of people haven't probably even thought about is even like contracts and stuff like that, which I don't know if that's been sorted out, because I know at least in our business, I'm assuming the NHL does something very similar with some of the stuff with incentive-based stuff, whether it's games played or, percentage of ice time played or different things like that. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that's kind of paid out and stuff like that for guys' contracts. I don't know if you know much about that either.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly, especially with the entry-level players, right, they have a lot of those bonus-laden contracts, right? So if you hit a certain goal mark, right, I mean, at what point, I guess it would be up to your agents potentially to make that case that, I was such and such a player was on pace, to hit that mark. They missed 10 games, but by the same token, I'm sure the counter-argument would be, well, if he was injured for 10 games, we wouldn't give him that bonus because he was on pace to hit that target. But these are extenuating circumstances, and it wasn't as if an injury kept him out. This was like an unforeseen, catastrophic event as far as sports is concerned, right? So that'll be interesting to see how that all shakes out. For sure, that's part of those mundane logistical things that I'm sure all the agents, lawyers, and the league's officials are trying to figure out as to what's going to happen when we hit the ice again.
Yeah, it's also unprecedented. To be honest, I'm very happy I have nothing to do with having to figure it out. Let's go a little more lighthearted here, Mike. Growing up, did you have a favorite team, favorite player? Like, what was your squad growing up?
Yeah, so my squad growing up was the Toronto Maple Leafs. I didn't really have a lot of say in that. My mom was a huge Leafs fan, so I was kind of just brought into it that way. But I mean, not to say that was a bad thing. I've always loved the Leafs since I was a kid. When I was growing up, some of I think the most iconic moments that I remember was, the '93 playoffs when the Kings played the Leafs in order to vie to go on to the Stanley Cup final. Ultimately, didn't go Toronto's way, but I mean, guys like Wendell Clark, Doug Gilmour, those are some of the players I idolized on the Leafs. But obviously, Gretzky was king when I was growing up, so it was always, everyone wanted to be like the great one. When you're playing road hockey outside, that's who you were. So yeah, I mean, that was kind of the two teams. I mean, I still do cheer for the Leafs. Obviously, I don't think just because I write for the Kings that I would put my allegiances aside. Certainly, I've become much more of a Kings fan in the last couple of years. But, as somebody who's never seen a championship won by a team that I've cheered for personally, that's kind of still one of those things I'm holding out hope for. So I won't abandon ship just yet until potentially that day comes.
I was going to ask you your opinion on a best player to ever play the game, and if you were contractually obligated to say Gretzky.
No, I wouldn't be contractually obligated. No, so I think I'd be free to kind of go off script there. I mean, I've had, I think my top five. I often kind of do a cop out and just have my top five in no particular order, right? I think
that's fair. I do the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can make the argument for Gretzky, but I also think you can make the argument for Lemieux. I think you can make the argument for Bobby Orr. So I think it just kind of depends on what mood you're in that day and who you're talking to, and you can kind of go in any different direction. I think that's those are, for your top three anyway, those are some pretty viable options.
I do the same thing, and I've been spicing it up a little bit. I throw Nick Lidstrom in there at 5, and it gets people a little, I didn't really think about that. I think it's because of the recency bias, but I mean, I think he deserves to be there. What that guy's done is incredible.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Definitely one of the best defensemen to ever play the game, for sure.
All right, Mike, one more question and we'll let you go. This is kind of our staple question. We ask everybody this. If you were commissioner of the day for the NHL and you could implement anything you wanted, what would you do to change the league right now, other than obviously bring it back?
Yeah, I think that would be on everybody's wish list. And I mean, obviously, I think a lot of people would say get rid of offside review, so I'm not going to say that, although I just did say that, because that's cheating, because that would be too easy. But one of the things I have said, and no one's really asked me this before, but one of the things I thought would be cool, just as a little feature, would be that the league used to have a rule that when you were serving a penalty, you had to serve that entire penalty regardless of how many times the opposition scored on you.
Yeah.
And so they had this rule in place until the 50s when, the Montreal Canadiens were just feasting on teams when they were on the man advantage. Jean Beliveau scored 4 power play goals one time, and that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. The other team's owners just kind of, at the annual meeting in the off season had finally got sick of that, and they got rid of the rule, right? Much to the dismay of Canadians and the Canadiens fans. So I would say that would be a cool thing to bring back, that no matter what it is, if you're serving a 2-minute minor and they score, you sit in the box until that 2 minutes is done.
I'll tell you what, I don't hate it.
Sorry, go ahead.
I don't hate that at all.
Yeah. So, I mean, that would be one, outside of getting rid of offsides and obviously the obvious of bringing the league back right now.
Mike, go ahead, AQ.
Cool, we'll leave you. Yeah, we'll leave you with one more here. So I've been asking guys, too. I mean, we've been doing this all year, too, and just kind of asking, same thing. Name your top 5 players in the NHL right now.
Okay, there we go.
Ooh, that's a good one. I didn't do my homework, but I mean, that's, go 6 days without hockey and you all of a sudden forget who's in the top 5. But I mean, Connor McDavid, Sidney Crosby, I'm going to throw Austin Matthews in there. Kind of hard not to talk about Leon Draisaitl right now as well.
Yeah.
And then, so how many am I at? 4?
Yep.
And then who would be my 5th?
Boy, you don't put Ovechkin in there, you're going to raise some eyebrows.
Yeah, and you know what? That's a fair point, because I've personally been an Ovechkin fan, since he came into the league. I just love the way that he plays. Obviously goal-scoring machine, but also just plays a really hard game when you're around him, right? So, yeah, let's go that. Add Ovechkin to round it out.
There you go. I mean, it's as easy as that.
Yeah, no, I haven't had a...
That's a good group. I'll take that group all day long.
Yeah.
All right, Mike. Can't thank you enough for taking time to talk with us. I really appreciate it. We're just trying to get some content out to the fans because there's no sports right now. So I mean, you think you help fill this void perfectly, being a historian and a writer and all. And everyone listening, please go follow Mike, because, like I said, and he said he tweets out this stuff, these daily facts on this day in the league, and it's awesome to follow, and you really get learned up on a lot of this stuff, and it makes you feel knowledgeable and powerful. And that's at Mike Commito on Twitter. Mike, you got anything else you want to plug?
No, I mean, that's definitely where you'll find all those daily tidbits. We're kind of on hiatus right now, but that's where you'll find all my King stuff when we kind of resume, and where you can find some Wolves updates as well. I do some stories for them still. So Twitter's definitely the best place to find me. And yeah, and if you're looking for something to read on the hiatus, definitely grab a copy of that book. It'll kind of keep you entertained for 365 days, but hopefully we don't have to wait that long for hockey.
Awesome. Love it. Mike, thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay, thanks. See you guys.